Princess Layla lived in a white tower on the edge of a quiet kingdom where the orchards smelled of orange blossom and the streets were paved with warm stones. She liked the daytime, the laughter of market vendors, the bright scarves of the children, and the slow, sleepy hum of bees in the palace gardens. But Layla's heart belonged to the night. On the night of her 17th birthday, she went out to the tower's balcony and heard a sound she had never heard before, a soft, silver whistle, like the wind threading a glass bottle. The stars seemed to answer the whistle with tiny blinking songs. Layla leaned over the stone balustrade and saw, far below the valley, lights moving like lanterns carried by invisible hands. "Moon gardeners," her nurse whispered when Layla told her. "Old tales say they come when the moon misses something." Layla felt a curious tug in her chest, as if the moon was calling her name. That night she dreamed of a gate made of moonlight and a garden where flowers opened only under star breaths. She woke before dawn, certain she would find out if the tale was true. Layla found the key in a place children rarely look, in the attic, tucked into an old chest of embroidered wedding cloths. The key was slender and cool, and on its bow was a tiny crescent carved as neatly as a smile. Beneath the key was a rolled map, brittle at the edges like dried petals. The map showed the kingdom from above, the river like a silver ribbon, the hills like sleeping beasts, and a small dot marked a moon garden outside the borders where no road bothered to go. Around the dot, moonlit paths were drawn in arcs and loops, and tiny stars were sketched like notes on a score. A note in her grandmother's handwriting read, "For the one who listens when the night sings." Layla tucked the map under her arm and decided, with that steady determination that sometimes visits at dawn, to find the moon garden. She packed bread, a jar of rose water, and the blue shawl her mother once wore. She left the tower while the servants slept and the palace lights dimmed. The woods that guarded the kingdom's edge stayed awake at night in a way that felt secretive rather than frightening. Owls blinked like wise buttons. Fireflies stitched the air with gold. Layla walked with the map held tight and the key warm in her palm. The trees seemed to lean closer as she passed, curious about the human who walked toward moonlight. Something in the woods giggled, a small, bright sound like pebbles laughing. A fox with a white patch on its chest trotted up, sat, and stared at her. Layla offered a slice of bread, which the fox took gently. It then walked a few paces, looked back, and waited. Layla followed. They crossed a brook that smelled of mint and old promises. The fox halted at a stone carved with spirals and paw prints. The mark matched one on her map. Layla pushed a little key-shaped notch on the stone, and a seam of light opened like a grin. The fox nosed through and then vanished. Layla, heart beating loud and brave, followed. At the heart of a clearing, where the moonlight pooled like water, rose a gate none in the kingdom had seen. It was woven of silver threads that looked as fragile as spider silk but dazzled with an inner strength. Hanging from the crossbar were 10 tiny bells, and each bell chimed with the tone of a different planet. An old gardener with hair like milky clouds tended the soil beyond the gate. He wore a coat sewn from night itself and held a lantern that glowed without flame. When Layla approached, the gardener paused, his hands stilling mid-planting. "You have the crescent key," he said, not as question but as greeting. His voice smelled faintly of lavender and midnight. Layla offered the key on both palms. The gardener smiled and looped it around a thread in the gate. The thread hummed and the bells chimed. The gate swung open like a page turned. "Welcome to the moon garden," he said. The moon called, the garden listens. We tend what the moon forgets. Inside the garden the air was cool and soft. Flowers opened and closed in slow, polite bows. Some were as pale as bones, others like eyes. There were trees whose leaves were made of tiny mirrors and fountains that sang in silver. Each plant, when Layla knelt to touch it, breathed a memory, not her memory but the moon's. A gull's first flight, a child's laugh in a distant sea, the shape of the first lost star. She found a bed of night bloom roses that hummed with an old lullaby. There was a vine that bore small glass fruit glowing with the light of a single sunset. A violet with petals like lace whispered that it remembered the color of a promise made on a key. Layla gathered a few petals and marveled at how each felt like a soft notebook page. The gardener watched her with eyes that carried the patience of seasons. "You can take nothing that belongs to the moon," he said kindly, "but you may carry a moon moment home, tucked in your memory." Layla tucked a rose petal into her shawl and felt the moon's warmth settle onto her shoulder like a companion. Near the center of the garden lay pools as flat and dark as polished onyx. The gardener explained that these were reflection pools, not for seeing one's face but for asking a question of the night. People from far lands had waded in to decide kings and carve paths. Owls used them to remember maps they had dreamed. Layla sat on the edge and whispered the first question that came to her. "What does the moon miss?" The pool stilled and then showed her a vision. The moon, alone beyond the farthest hills, watched the world and missed stories. It missed the small, messy, human things, gossip at the well, warm bread cooled by the window, the hush between two friends who shared a secret. "You see," said the gardener softly, "the moon keeps watch, but it cannot hold the fullness of the world alone. That is why the moon garden stores what slips past." Layla pressed her fists in her lap. The thought made her feel both tender and very determined. As Layla rose from the pool, a chill wind snuffed the lanterns. Shadows lengthened into fingers. Something brittle and quick darted between the plants. A night thief, the gardener called it. In legend, night thieves were not cruel. They simply collected loneliness and mislaid wishes. But tonight the thief moved with intent, and the gardener's face creased. "It is taking the hush between friends," he said. "It eats the small silences that teach people to listen." Layla followed the rustle. The thief was a creature wrapped in shadow-like paper, with eyes that glowed like embers. It hopped and stole a bell from the gate, ate a memory of a lullaby, and grew brighter. Layla, remembering the moon's missing stories, decided she would not let it take more. She took from her shawl the rose petal she had tucked there. It glowed a fragile silver and hummed the lullaby. Layla held it out. The thief paused, sniffed, and then, to her surprise, it crumpled into something very small and soft like a torn scrap of night. The thief's hunger eased, and it curled round the petal like a cat. The gardener breathed relief. "You gave it a story," he said. "Not all things must be taken. Some can be shared." The moon rose higher, a bright coin balancing on the black. Layla sat with the gardener and the tiny thief at her feet. The gardener told her the moon garden needed more than tending. It needed someone who remembered the world clearly enough to tell the moon when stories were missing. You may return, he offered, but the garden asks for a pact. The moon will give you a single gift, a way to send one story back each month. For that, you must promise to share what you learn, in laughter, in bread, in the hush between two friends. Layla thought of the city's bright noons and the quiet of the baker's shop where old men told tales while kneading dough. She promised. The gardener took a seed from his coat, not quite a seed, more like a curved sliver of silver, and placed it in her palm. Plant this under a window where someone sleeps, he instructed. Whisper your story into the soil at midnight. When she planted the seed on her balcony that night, the seed drank moonlight and swelled. Layla whispered the first story, the tale of the night thief who crumpled when offered a lullaby. The seed pulsed and released a soft glow. From then on, once a month at midnight, the balcony's little vase would bloom a single petal carrying a moon moment for someone in the city to find. Layla returned to the tower as the horizon began to bruise with early dawn. The city bustled unaware of the secret she carried. She baked bread each day now, for herself at first, then for the gardener who had once been an old friend of her grandmother, then for the children at the corner of the market. She told stories with the bread, a small tale tucked into the crust like a seed, or an idea whispered into the flour while kneading. People began to listen differently. A quarrel that used to end in slammed doors stopped with a pause and a look. Two neighbors who had lived with the same grievance for years found that one evening, tucked into their basket was a petal that smelled of moon-sweet roses and softened their voices. The city warmed. Layla kept a careful map of where the petals bloomed and who smiled because of them. Every month a little petal would appear on her balcony. Sometimes it carried the sound of a far-off sea, sometimes the pattern of a swing shadow on summer grass. Layla learned to choose which story to send back to the moon garden and which to keep in the city where people needed it most. Years passed measured by petals. Layla grew in wisdom the way the moon waxed and waned, gentle, patient, surprising. The gardener grew older, and one autumn, his hair was more cloud than ever. He placed his hands on Layla's and said, "You have learned to listen. The garden will not forget, and neither will I." One winter night, the stars whistled again, but this time the tune was different, not lonely but threaded with many voices. Layla went to the gate and found it open, its bells chiming softly. The little night thief, now more like a shadowed kitten than a menace, curled against her ankle. The moon hung low and full, like a friend come to tea. "You kept your promise," the moon seemed to say, and a breeze carried down from the sky a dozen small, bright seeds. "We will remember together." Layla accepted the seeds and planted them in the palace's forgotten courtyard. Where each seed took root, a new corner of the moon garden opened in the city, nights where neighbors sat together and traded stories like ribbons, where children learned that the hush between them could hold kindness, where bakers tucked moon petals into loaves for strangers. Layla lived a long life not because of crowns or jewels, but because she practiced the small miracle of keeping stories and sharing them. When she was old and grey and the city had grown into a place where moonflowers bloomed on many balconies, children would climb her knees and ask about the gate of silver threads. She would smile, her eyes like moonlit pools, and tell them what the garden taught her, that the moon watches, waits, and remembers, that sometimes it misses the simple things, and that when people are brave enough to listen, they can bring back the stories the moon has missed. And if you walk by that city at night, when the air smells of baking and jasmine, you might see a faint glow on a balcony and hear, very softly, a bell chiming in the distance. The moon garden, remembering.